When we got to the end of Houston and had to make a left onto Elm Street, it was less than a 90-degree turn. And this is a pretty good sized car. And it took the driver quite a bit to make that turn, get into that position to straighten out. He had to go so slow that some of the motorcycle outriders had to drop off in the process. Next slide. This is just before we get, next slide. Next slide. So we started to straighten up as we're going down Elm Street. About 80 to 100 feet down Elm, I was scanning to the left, which was the grassy area where there were some photographers and some people, not very many. I heard an explosive noise to my right rear, to the right rear of the motorcade. I started to move from my scanning to my left to scan back to where the noise came from, my right rear. In the process, I scanned across the presidential vehicle. And what I saw was the president grab at his throat and move to his left. I knew he was in trouble. Something was wrong. So I jumped from the car and I ran. During the process of running, they tell me there was a second shot. I did not hear that one. Just before I got to the car, the driver began to accelerate slowly. This is a heavy car, not armored in any sense, but it was heavy. And as I tried to get on the car, I slipped as he tried to accelerate the car. About that time, the third shot rang out, and it hit the president in the head. Hit him right above the right ear to the rear of the head. It left a gaping wound, so much so that blood, brain material, and bone fragments came out onto myself and the trunk of the car. About that time, Mrs. Kennedy got up on the back of the car. She was trying to retrieve some material that came off the president's head. She didn't know I was there. When I grabbed her, I put her into the back seat. When I did that, the president's body fell to its left into her lap. His right side of his face was up. I could see his eyes were fixed. There was a large hole in the upper rear of his head. All the material in that area had been removed. It was scattered all throughout the car, including over Mrs. Kennedy. I turned and gave the follow-up car crew a thumbs down, letting them know we were in a dire situation. The driver continued to accelerate, and we proceeded to go as fast as we could, and we got up alongside the lead car being driven by Chief Curry, the chief of police in Dallas, Texas. We were screaming at him to get us to a hospital. He got in front of the presidential limousine and led us to the nearest hospital, which was Parkland Hospital in Dallas. When we got to Parkland, we expected to have people there meeting us. Nobody was there. The advance agent from the lead car jumped out, ran into the emergency room, found that one of the attendants was trying to come out to help us, but he was trying to bring out 2 gurneys at one time and he couldn't come through the doorway. And so the agent grabbed one of the gurneys, brought it out. The other gurney the attendant brought out, came to the car. About at that time, Emory Roberts, Doug Roberts' father, who was the senior agent in the follow-up car, came up alongside the presidential vehicle, looked into the back seat, saw the condition the president was in, turned and said, "I'm taking my men to Johnson." He knew it was a fatal wound, and it was the right thing to do. It was a tough decision, but it had to be made. And so they took Vice President Johnson and Mrs. Johnson into another section of the Parkland Hospital and secured them in that area. Our first job was to get the governor out of the car. Halfway down from the incident where it occurred to Parkland, the governor had raised up slightly, and I realized that he had also been shot. His front of his clothing was covered in blood. So we had to remove him first. He was sitting in a jump seat immediately in front of the president. He tried to help us, but he was so weak he couldn't. We lifted him up, put him on a gurney. Mrs. Connolly and he raced into the emergency room, and they put him in one of the 2 trauma rooms. Then we were going to remove the president. But Mrs. Kennedy had a hold of the president and wouldn't let go. I pleaded with her to no avail. So I realized the problem was she didn't want anybody to see the condition he was in, because it was very, very gory. So I took off my suit coat, put it over his head and his upper torso, and then she let go of the body. picked the president up, put him on a gurney. She followed. We raced into the emergency room, put him in trauma room 2, I believe it was. When we got in there, there were doctors running all over the place. One time, I think I counted 12. They were trying to work on the president. They did everything they could to try and revive him. About that time, Mr. Kellerman, who was the senior agent there, yelled at me, "Get the White House on the phone, let them know what's going on." When we traveled in those days, we had a switchboard that traveled with us. It was called the Dallas White House. And so I got the number for that switchboard, dialed that number, got the operator there, Dallas, told him that I wanted to be connected to the White House in Washington to keep the line open. Nobody was to cut in, and because this was a very extreme situation, they did that. I began to explain what was going on to the agent in charge in Washington. About that time, Kellerman asked for the phone back. He started to explain. Then a doctor came running out of the emergency room saying, "He's breathing." So Mrs. Kennedy ran into the emergency room. Mr. Kellerman threw me the phone. He ran in there. So I got back on the phone. About that time, the operator cut in and said, "Mr. Hill, Attorney General Kennedy wants to talk to you." I said, "Okay." I said, "Yes, Mr. Attorney General, what can I do for you?" He said, "Tell me what's happened down there." So I told him about the president being shot, Governor Connolly being shot. We were in the emergency room. They were working on him. He said, "Well, how bad is it?" I didn't want to tell Attorney General Robert Kennedy that his brother was dead. So I simply said, "It's as bad as it can get." And with that, he hung up the phone, and that's how he found out that his brother had been killed.